Stop. Before you scroll past this, before you assume this is just another Middle East story about oil prices and sanctions and military posturing, I need you to understand something that almost nobody in Western media is actually saying out loud. What is happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz is not a story about Iran. Iran is the stage. Yeah, the real drama, the one that will define the next decade of global power, is the conversation happening between Washington and Beijing. And it is a conversation conducted not in words, but in warships, tankers, and the white-knuckle silence of two nuclear powers daring each other to blink first. Let's start with what we know. The United States military blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz began at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday, and China's foreign ministry wasted no time calling it a dangerous and irresponsible act that risks inflaming tensions across the entire region. CNBC. Now, if you've been paying attention to Chinese diplomatic language for the past decade, you know that Beijing does not use words like dangerous and irresponsible casually. That is not bureaucratic noise. That is a signal. And the question every serious analyst should be asking right now is not what China said, it's what China meant. With roughly 98% of Iranian oil exports bound for China and a summit between President Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping just weeks away, Washington's maximum pressure campaign on Iran risks destabilizing the fragile dance that the administration has carefully cultivated with Beijing. CNBC, think about that number for a moment, 98%, that is not a trade relationship. That is a lifeline. That is the kind of economic dependency that transforms a diplomatic dispute into something existential, something that forces a government to make decisions it would rather never have to make. Now, here is where it gets genuinely interesting and genuinely dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway between Iran, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, carries roughly 20 million barrels of oil a day, along with about 1 of global liquefied natural gas. Fox News, 1/5 of the world's LNG. Every ship that passes through that narrow corridor is not just carrying fuel. It is carrying the economic oxygen that keeps factories running, keeps hospitals lit, keeps food cold, keeps civilization humming at its modern, complicated pace. And right now, the United States Navy has stationed itself at that corridor and said nothing moves without our permission. The month-long disruption in the Strait of Hormuz has sparked warnings of an energy shortage worse than the 1970s oil crisis, when an embargo by Arab producers on countries aligned with the U.S. quadrupled oil prices, prompting fuel rationing across major economies. CNBC, the head of the International Energy Agency, has called this the worst energy shock the world has ever seen. Worse than the 1970s, worse than the Ukraine war. Let that land. We are living through the worst energy crisis in recorded history, and the dominant conversation in most Western newsrooms is still framed as a bilateral standoff between America and Iran. It is not. It never was. Some 38% of the oil and 23% of the liquefied natural gas that typically passes through the Hormuz Strait is bound for Chinese ports. Overall, that accounts for about half of China's seaborne oil supply and a sixth of its natural gas. CNN, half of China's seaborne oil supply runs through a strait that the United States has just declared under its operational control. You want to understand why Beijing's language hardens so sharply on Tuesday. That is why you do not announce a blockade on a waterway that carries half of your competitor's seaborne oil without expecting that competitor to treat it as an act of strategic aggression. Trump may have aimed at Thrawn, but the bullet is also flying toward Beijing, and Xi Jinping knows it. China holds 1.3 billion barrels in strategic reserves, enough for 120 days, the Jerusalem Post. That sounds reassuring until you realize that 120 days is not infinity. It is a deadline, it is a countdown clock, and every morning that the blockade continues, that clock ticks a little louder. Shandong's independent refineries, which process 90% of the Iranian oil reaching China, depend on below-market prices, Replacement barrels would cost $10 to $12 more per barrel. The Jerusalem Post, that cost difference multiplied across millions of barrels, across hundreds of days, across an already slowing Chinese economy, is not trivial. It is a slow hemorrhage dressed up in the language of geopolitical patience. And now look at what Beijing is doing in response, because this is the chess move that most commentators are missing entirely. Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, arrived in Beijing to meet President Xi Jinping, and Moscow has offered to help China with any potential energy shortfall, stating that Russia can fill the resource gap that has arisen in China and other countries interested in working on a mutually beneficial basis. CNBC Russia is the emergency supplier. Russia is the insurance policy. And the moment that Washington tightened the Hormuz corridor, Moscow pulled its chair a little closer to Beijing's table. Do you understand what that means strategically? Every day the blockade continues. The Washington versus Beijing dynamic is slowly becoming a Washington versus Beijing and Moscow dynamic. Trump may believe he is squeezing Iran. He is simultaneously pushing the two countries he most needs to keep divided into tighter alignment. China's foreign ministry spokesperson Gu Jiaqin told reporters that the Strait of Hormuz is an important international trade route for goods and energy, and that keeping the area safe and stable and ensuring unimpeded passage serves the common interest of the international community. Newsweek, diplomatically elegant, carefully worded, technically neutral, but beneath that diplomatic elegance is a very clear message. China considers free passage through the Strait of Hormuz to be a matter of common international law, not American discretion. And the subtext, the part that doesn't appear in the official transcript, is this: if you challenge that principle, you are not just challenging China's energy supply. You are challenging China's conception of its sovereign rights as a global economic power. Signs of friction are already emerging. China threatened to retaliate with countermeasures against any U.S. attempt to use weapons sales as a pretext for additional tariffs, with the foreign ministry rejecting what it called groundless smears and malicious linkage. CNBC groundless smears and malicious linkage. Again, pay attention to the language. That is not the measured response of a government that feels secure. That is the sharpened rhetoric of a government that believes it is being cornered and is letting Washington know quietly, firmly, without triggering a market panic, that there is a line it will not allow to be crossed. A U.S. interception of a Chinese vessel would likely become a major incident, as China would make a point of standing up to the U.S. in a situation like this, leaving the relationship in a fundamentally different place than where it is now. CNBC, according to David Meal, head of China practice at Eurasia Group, a fundamentally different place. That is the clinical language of a think tank analyst describing what, in plain terms, would be a rupture. Not just a diplomatic setback, not just a trade dispute, but the kind of maritime incident that rewrites alliance structures, accelerates military spending, and haunts textbooks for generations. We are one miscalculation at sea away from that scenario. A U.S. sanctioned tanker linked to China sailed out of the Strait of Hormuz and into the Gulf of Oman on Tuesday after Trump's naval blockade came into effect. CNBC one tanker, one quiet, deliberate passage through a blockade that the United States Navy had just announced to the world. Beijing did not hold a press conference about it. It did not send a tweet. It just moved a ship through the water and let the action speak in the language that actually matters between great powers, the language of demonstrated capability and calculated defiance. The blockade does not need to stop every barrel. It needs to make the cost of continuing the trade higher than the cost of stopping it, and it needs to present Beijing with a menu in which every option serves American interests, the Jerusalem Post. That is the strategic logic behind what the Pentagon is doing. Force Beijing to choose between bad options, and no matter what China picks, the United States wins something. If China backs down and pressures Iran to negotiate, Washington gets a deal. If China confronts the Navy directly, Washington gets to frame China as the aggressor. If China absorbs the cost quietly and waits, Washington gets 120 days of leverage before the reserves run out. It is a trap constructed with considerable sophistication. The question is whether Beijing recognizes it as a trap or whether it has already decided the trap itself is the provocation that justifies changing the rules of the game entirely. Taking more oil off the market, particularly the only oil that is now getting out from the Persian Gulf, will drive oil prices to around $150 per barrel. CNBC, according to analysts at the Quincy Institute, $150 per barrel. In a global economy already staggering under the weight of tariffs, post-pandemic supply chain fragility, and a manufacturing sector running on borrowed confidence, a $150 barrel does not just hurt consumers at the pump. It triggers cascading failures across fertilizer production, shipping logistics, airline capacity, pharmaceutical supply chains, and food security in the developing world. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a choke point for oil, it is a choke point for the entire material infrastructure of modern civilization. And here is the part that should keep serious people awake at night. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran that preceded this blockade was already fragile. And analysts have warned that a miscalculation could rapidly turn diplomatic posturing into a full crisis. Newsweek fragile is the operative word. We are operating in a theater where one misread signal, one captain who panics, one drone that flies 100 meters in the wrong direction converts a political standoff into a kinetic reality that no government on any side of this dispute actually wants. The tragedy of great power competition is that the most catastrophic outcomes are almost never the ones that were chosen. They are the ones that slipped past every checkpoint because everyone assumed someone else would stop it. How Beijing calibrates its diplomacy in this critical ceasefire phase will be linked directly to how much pressure its economy is under. CNN, that is the variable that matters most right now. Not Trump's tweets, not Iran's declarations, not the Pentagon's press briefings. The variable that matters is how much economic pain China is willing to absorb before it decides that silence is no longer a strategy, that the cost of inaction has finally exceeded the cost of direct confrontation. When that calculation shifts, and history tells us it always does, the world that exists on the other side of that shift will be genuinely unrecognizable from the one we inhabit today. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 miles wide at its narrowest point, 33 miles separating the Persian Gulf from the Gulf of Oman, separating $150 oil from the current market price, separating a tense but manageable standoff from the geopolitical rupture of the century. And right now, within those 33 miles, the United States Navy and the Chinese merchant fleet are engaged in a slow, quiet, enormously consequential test of wills. A test that neither Washington nor Beijing has publicly acknowledged, that most Western media has barely begun to understand, and that the rest of the world is watching with a mixture of dread and the creeping, nauseating certainty that the adults have left the room.